Next, we have Kinewesquao, or Catherine Richardson. She is the director of First People Studies at Concordia University in, I didn't practice this. Chojage. A counselor and an advocate for victims of violence. Her research has included domestic homicide in Canada, structural violence against youth, systemic mother and victim blaming, and response-based practice. Catherine is a member of the Métis Nation with Cree and Gwich'in ancestry. Her work is aimed at helping people recover from violence in a spirit of dignity and social justice. She is the author of several books and has been working in Indigenous communities for over 25 years. Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Martha's getting this set up. I'll just say that I'm also, in addition to being an academic, a counselor and family therapist, and would say that I work from an anti-colonial or indigenous informed perspective. So my talk takes a little journey through different aspects of life in Canada that cause harm for Indigenous people, and specifically for Indigenous women or mothers. And so you're going to get a little bit of Indigenous studies and history and sociology and social work. So I'm coming in from a lot of different perspectives, and I'm going to build on some of the things that Karine was sharing about like what are the mechanics that actually lead to children being removed, for example. So here we go. So I just acknowledge that I live and work in Tiohtià:ke on the lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. And I also want to pay my respects to the peoples from this territory, the Tongva people, the ancestors. And I always like to invite you to bring your ancestors into the room or connect to that long line of family that you have that goes back to the beginning of human inhabitation, wherever you come from, and to acknowledge the beautiful Mother Earth and how we are given everything that we need to survive on a daily basis. So there's a beautiful land acknowledgement and explanation. I'll let you have a look at that if you want to learn more about this land. I won't show it right now because we've done a beautiful land acknowledgement at the beginning. Yeah, so this is me. And I'm going to tell a little bit of my personal and family story as well. And just to say that I work with 3 other beautiful human beings. I call it in Northern Turtle Island. And we have developed what's called response-based practice. And it's basically an approach to helping people recover from violence that looks at what they already know and do. It looks at how they respond to adverse situations, how they use the teachings they were given. And we don't talk about how people are affected. That seems like half of a social interaction. We're interested in the complete ongoing interaction between different people in the particular context. And one of a beautiful woman I consider one of my elders, Anne Majerader, was in Karine's video, and she has in a way been one of the elders for our project and has implemented this approach in her Kaska community in Watson Lake, Yukon. So here we go. I just love this old poster. Did anyone remember this poster? It says, class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on. Class analysis is knowing who's there with you. This is from the 60s, the 70s. And I think holding on to that awareness is one way to, for me anyway, to stay psychologically safe in the room. I will be talking about violence and trying to use accurate language, but in careful ways. And you do what you already know how to do to take care of yourself. And I invite people also to align with the spirit of your own ancestors, their histories of resistance and knowledge about how to be as well as possible during really trying times. And I love these words of Zora Neale Hurston. You know, I'm not going to sit here and sink. I do not weep at the world. I'm too busy sharpening my oyster knife. I just love that sentiment. So the question of genocide is never far from discussions of settler colonialism. Land is life, or at least land is necessary for life. Thus, contests for land can be, indeed, often are contests for life. So I have chosen some pictures here that relate to that period in history where people were fighting uranium, and I hope they still are, uranium extraction. And I Googled like the nuclear family, and I often refer to Kim Tallbear's work because I just love that work of looking at how families used to be before colonization. So when I Googled nuclear family, I got a nuclear family here, but I also got a family in a nuclear fallout shelter there. Russell Means and some folks from AIM and Wounded Knee. And the reason I do this is because it backgrounds the story of my own family. When my mom was a teenager, they moved to Uranium City in Saskatchewan, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So this forms some of the backdrop, or how we think, my colleagues and I, how we think about the lives of Indigenous people, the institutions that continue to oppress, and how we can develop an analysis and bring that forward when there's these particular conditions, when our institutions conceal the violence and the related forms of administrative domination. And this relates to, you know, the Indian Act and certain laws and policies that are still in place that probably should have gone, you know, at least 50 years ago. It obscures or conceals the responsibility of those who have perpetrated violence. So I'm going to talk about state impunity and impunity for the perpetrators in relation to Indigenous women. It conceals the ongoing and multifaceted resistance of those who have been victimized, and it blames and pathologizes those who have been harmed, casting them as deficient others, and using, you know, mainstream psychology to create this image that we are all mentally ill, because we talk about trauma, and I know we use that word in colloquial ways, but if we follow the assumption from some psychological theories that say, if you have experienced, say, incarceration in residential schools, then your relatives are traumatized, and that's a mental illness. And so if you're all cast as being unfit intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, it just furthers the pathway of removing children and removing everything that's sacred to us, because again, we're reduced to this idea of being wards of the state and not full citizens. So in terms of, you know, in Indigenous studies, here's a little bit of background, but there's a history of legislation in Canada that made it impossible for Indigenous people to live full lives. And these policies were meant directly to undermine sovereignty and the communities and the culture. And so I know you've all heard about this. One of the things that really struck me when I was researching my family's history was this change to the Indian Act that took place in 1936, which transferred sort of responsibility for First Nations people from the Department of the Interior to the Department of Lands, Mines, and Resources. And what that meant was that mining companies and the CEOs made every decision about Indigenous people, which is really scary, right? So who you can still ask who's really like running the country. So this is my family, and I always like to show pictures of people being together, families celebrating each other, you know, doing cultural things and being strong and proud and upright. And a lot of the work that we've been doing, and I'm really glad to see that it's happening here too. I love some of the slides that Dawn shared, for example. They're really going to be helpful. We study the parallels between violence against women and violence against Mother Earth or the land. And so I just brought my latest book just to show. This book is part personal story, but part sort of guide for human service workers. And I start off talking about what it's like to be in the hospital. And it was about my journey through my second bout of cancer and chemotherapy and radiation, and what it's like to be in a mainstream hospital and how to try to navigate that system and find allies and find ways to talk about when something isn't right in your body, how to talk about that without it being a big fight. You know, like everyone says, oh, you can beat this, or you're fighting cancer, you're fighting this. And it just didn't fit for me as a way to talk about our body and what was happening. But I just want to share the first line of the book, because I think this is what the book is about. It says, nowhere in the texts on counseling, recovery, or lifespan development does it make links between well-being and not having your land stolen. And I think that says it all, really. But the rest of the chapters are about, working with families and children and integrating ritual and culture into your practice. So I've been working a lot with Barb McInerney, and she's at Kayushi's place. She's the head of the transition homes, women's refuges in Whitehorse. And she also works closely with Anne Majurator, who is one of the elders in the film. So this is a picture of Uranium City, and that's my mom and her best friend up in the top left. I just think it's so funny that they walked around with guns, but that was their life. And in that period of time, the American Army was all across the north in Canada, and they were extracting uranium, and they were linked to the Manhattan Project. And so it was the ore that was taken from Delaunay, Northwest Territories, which isn't too far from here, that was used to build the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in a way, this part of this environment is in our bones. And in the Yukon, the soldiers were all across there building roads and working on the dew line a little bit further north. And I guess what I wanted to say about that is we know about currently all the cases of sexualized assault in the military. You hear about that all the time, and in the police too. So this was happening there, and all these processes made life very unsafe for Indigenous women and girls and communities. And with all the mining up there, it's continuing to do the same. So I was really glad to hear that Dawn is also making a map about the overlap of disappearance sites of women with the man camps. So we're continuing to work on that analysis. So this is a picture of my grandma here on your left. And when I knew her, when she was about 30 years old, she had no hair from being exposed to radioactivity. She always wore a wig and false teeth. And it was really scary at nighttime. Sometimes I'd see her in a room and she didn't have her wig on or her teeth. But she used to keep like activated ore, rocks around her flower bed. And my grandpa kept them in the basement. And I think my grandpa and my mom for a little while worked in this uranium lab. And so in this picture, I have a body cast on, and you can't see it, but what linked up for me with that later is when my parents realized there was something wrong with me and I couldn't walk, they sent me to the Toronto Children's Hospital. But I later learned that there was an Indian hospital in the town of Nanaimo where I was living on Vancouver Island. And that was kept hidden, the existence of Indian hospitals until about, 20 years ago, they started to talk about it. And there was a documentary on CBC radio about it. And then I learned that The children who were in hospital beds there, they were casted, which meant that the workers, like the nurses mostly, didn't want the children to run around and try and play or crawl out of their crib. So they put these body casts on them as a way to keep them down. So I had a different experience because I had a white dad, right? So it all helped in my learning to think about this. And so one of the acts of harm was if you were parents and you had your child in an Indian hospital, you may be forbidden from visiting them. And of course, you can imagine how devastating that is on both sides. So I drew this from the report. I won't talk about it too much because Karine already has a beautiful image that was created for the project by Melissa Johns. Again, beautiful report. Good work, Karine. Excuse me. So looking at Canada, how could we describe the colonial context of men's violence if I look at it from a gender lens? So in the RCMP, tons of sexual assault by its members, ongoing militarization of their program. They actually have an NGO or a charity fund that collects money from rich donors who are often invested in mining companies to suppress Indigenous resistance. So this is happening more and more in Canada. The military refusing to investigate a lot of sexualized violence, child protection, of course, the criminal code. There's a lot of mutualizing in terms of women, but also even children, devastatingly. They're using ideas of mutualization as if children could consent or that women could consent to violence to grant impunity to perpetrators. And I'll give more examples of that later. So we use family law, psychology and psychiatry, and all sorts of things. So we have ongoing forms of colonial and genocidal violence. And you could sort of map out Canada and, point out places that have been real hotspots like Val-d'Or, Quebec, that decade where the police were sexually assaulting Indigenous women, taking them for these, what do they call, moonlight cruises, like dropping people off in the middle of winter in a field, demanding, so-called sex, but it's obviously violence, and getting away with it largely. And so Val-d'Or, Thunder Bay, many young people that came from the north to study. And lots of people would say this is an ongoing form of educational violence, residential school type violence, because there's not a lot of schooling in the north for Indigenous teenagers. So they often have to go to southern communities where they face a lot of violence. So a very high number of Indigenous youth have been found dead in Thunder Bay in the waters there, and the police have been found to be complicit, but of course deny their involvement or justify their lack of looking for these young people. And I guess in terms of services, one thing that we really need to create and fund is just more places where Indigenous men can go and get help for their issues, especially if they have been suffering or using violence, because they deserve that care and those don't really exist. And so it's continuing to cause some problems. So in terms of the field of psychology, it's really struck me that the field developed in the 1800s alongside empire. The European powers, particularly the four main ones, were attacking all over the world and divvying up the land. But when you look at psychological writings, nowhere does it say that people all over the world are resisting imperialism and colonialism. And actually, whenever we are mistreated, we do something to show some form of protest, but that was completely left out of the literature of psychology. And yet we know that we have rich histories of resistance. So this kind of code still exists today in how service providers treat people, often in how they treat Indigenous people. I like Fanon's critique of psychology, basically saying a normal Black child will be made abnormal by the slightest contact with the white world. So I'm not going to go into my big critique of trauma, but in terms of an actual disease in the DSM, we'll just say it's called PTSD, but nothing is post. You know, the P stands for post, nothing is over. And these diagnoses do not comment on the fact that the quality of social responses that people get after they disclose violence or when they seek help is so negative that that amplifies their suffering. I wanted to comment on failure to protect, and I'll just show these slides. So I've co-authored a book called Failure to Protect, and basically it's how in the child welfare system, we blame mothers for the violence of fathers. So this is standard practice. If a mother has been harmed by her male partner and the police find out or somebody reports, the police have to call child protection. So child protection come in and they say, basically, why were you so stupid to get together with a man who would hurt you? Because of your poor judgment, we're going to remove your children from you. And we're going to use psychology to develop a case of your mental instability. So I wanted just to point to these early studies, I guess from the 60s. This is Martin Seligman's study. This idea of flight and freeze, it came from torturing dogs. He tied them up in a little box that was divided in two, ran electric shocks through them and said, look, how come they don't escape? And there's, you know, they got tired of predicting when they were going to get shocked. I mean, it's a long story, but he said, oh, they have learned helplessness or they're freezing. And then we took these ideas and we applied them to people, but mostly to women. And so social workers today will say, there's codependency or attachment or borderline or whatever. And we apply this to traumatized people to build a case why they won't do anything to help themselves and say that now there's something with their brain they can't. But these are all used to justify removing children. So I'm just going to talk about sovereignty. We talk about sovereignty of land. I believe there should be a concept called sovereignty of families, and that families should always be consulted before decisions are made about children. The ongoing removal of children is contributing to genocide. And in the child welfare system, like once you're in there, so many bad things happen to children, and children are unfortunately dying or being killed or dying from neglect or from running away and ending up on the street in really dangerous situations. So we have to look at the system in its entirety. So I have to stop in a minute. I'm just going to show a few slides that will just wound it up. So this is the book that I was talking about. And also today, we use this idea of parental alienation. So if a mother is with her children and the judge says that the children have to go visit a dad who's been violent, if the mother talks to the children about safety planning, you know, here, I'll buy you a little cell phone, hide it in your bag, call grandma if something happens, that kind of thing. And if there's a custody case, or if it's in the child welfare court, and they find out that the mother is like talking badly about the abuser or about the father, they accuse her of being an alienating parent, and they will also remove children now from mothers who are considered to be alienating. So this is really undermining a woman's ability to try to keep her children safe when the system is failing her. Yeah, so we just need to look at, I think you called it an encounter, Karine. We call them social responses. So people that report violence or disclose, they say that they mostly receive negative social responses from family, friends, and professionals. And that can mean that they're not always believed, or they're treated in a racist manner, or all sorts of things can happen. Of course, there's mixed responses, and sometimes people do receive positive ones as well. But if you really want to help people to recover from violence, we have to work in a way across sectors to ensure that they're going to be believed, treated with kindness, and given the help and services that they need. And I would say that the negative social responses in society are probably the number one influencer of suicide, because when they're negative, the person is more likely to receive a psychological diagnosis and perhaps to be over medicated, that kind of thing. So we're doing lots of projects, my little team and I. We've developed an Islands of Safety model to intervene, to help Indigenous families safety plans so that children won't be removed. We did a Together for Justice project over 2 years in the Yukon, basically with our CMP, trying to contest racism against Indigenous folks in the communities. At a school in Watson Lake, the young people developed the Youth for Safety and Justice program. And yeah, there's lots of things we're trying to do, and to just hold up Indigenous people, Indigenous women as being worthy of care and love and belonging in society like everyone else. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So let's again use Eve Tuck's method for Q&A and collaborate and chat with each other and sort of peer review together and come up with a question or a comment or a reflection for Catherine. Okay, Regan's ready with the microphone in the back, especially if you haven't asked a question yet. Maybe this is your opportunity. We would love to hear from everybody and get everybody involved. So if you're ready with a question for Catherine, please raise your hand or make eye contact with Regan. She's standing at the back with the microphone. Our Native American student representative.
Hi, I'm Sedona. We met earlier. I was wondering, I'm from within the US, so I don't know how the system works up there, but here when a child displays signs of hurting themselves or others, or traumatic responses to things, they can be sent by law to an institution, to like a mental health board or something like that, without their parents' consent or engagement. Really, they just get taken and put in that situation, which can then be further traumatizing. The element of taking the kid away, it's very dramatic and horrible. So I was wondering, is that kind of the same situation up there? And did you guys engage with that element of removal from homes and pathologization of children and their mothers and parents?
Sending children to a locked facility that has / mental hospital hasn't been a big aspect of it, but what we consider genocidal is that social workers typically do not really try to find kinship placements or in community placements. And they send them to what I would call mainstream foster homes, mostly white foster homes of a different religion. And they are, there's lots of identity issues, but children, I won't say so much maybe right now, but in the last, say, 50 years have really been treated like slaves, like put to work. Even Métis children, for example, in residential schools, the residential schools were designed for First Nations children. So the Métis were considered to need to pay their way. So were sent to work in the fields or do lots of sort of unpaid labor. So we also have, I guess you'd say, group homes. They're more for teenagers. And so I was involved in Quebec in working with a child welfare agency, looking at complaints. So I went to some of the group homes and talked to the young people. I guess what the key aspect of what you're talking about is the lack of consent of parents, the lack of approaching and having any conversations, taking children away and actually not even telling the family where they're going, not allowing the family to visit them. Like these are all the what I would call the human rights violations. But in my work in Montreal right now, a lot of Indigenous young people, if they have troubles, they might check themselves into like a psych ward. And what I think is really interesting about that is they go there, and if they're not treated super badly in the waiting room, in the intake process, which they often are treated badly, but when they get in there, they sit in a room for a day and really nobody talks to them. There's no intervention. And then if they go in on Friday night, on Sunday, they're sent home. And they didn't really get any help. They just sat in a room, maybe with a TV for a day and a half. So I'm not really getting right at your question, but I think the violations are that we don't seek consent from parents. We don't ask, are there facilities in your Indigenous community or directed by Indigenous agencies that would have cultural aspects? So we're basically just taking children and sending them into this kind of wilderness where they are very alone and isolated and likely to suffer more. And what we're doing, I think, as part of a national healing project is helping to reconnect young people and older people too with the culture and community they came from. And those institutional processes completely undermine that. So I hope I answered your question enough.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Again, this is teamwork, and we had a lot to say about that. We were really struck by your comment how important it is to have supports for men, because obviously gender-based violence against women is a function of like colonial matrix of heteropatriarchal gender relations. So it has to be complex. We even talked about how even in like the Congo, right, there is focus on supporting men and having organizations for men specifically to stem out violence. So maybe you'd like to develop it. And just like I had one other comment that we can, just looking at the images you are showing and that Karina was showing, I just want to draw our attention to those representations because images matter. And we have, you know, the red dress symbol, and that was in the, we wear pins, we wear earrings. There were like amazing artistic projects like Jamie Black and Rebecca Belmore and Christy Belcourt and so many others. And some of the amazing literature, right? Like Michelle Good won like the governor's award for 10 Little Indians, and Tracy Lindbergh with Birdie. This is like amazing imaginative responses. So I think this, I call it like, I don't know, what did I call it? Oh, sovereign imagination, right? It's
Nice.
just really, really powerful and an important response. And since we are showing so many images, I just wanted to kind of bring it to the forefront.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Congo. They also have a city of joy there, Evensler. So a community where no men are welcome. The women there are, and children are survivors of sexualized violence, and their healing program is to sing together every day. I just love that, and I wish that we could do more of that. Part of the lack of analysis in Canada that I think is troubling in order to deal with the issue of violence against Indigenous women is that sometimes in communities, the perpetrators are, you know, men, boyfriends, husbands. But I mean, in my research, I would say that over half the time, the perpetrators are white men, and they target Indigenous women, young women in cities, in, you know, bars, restaurants, wherever. And a lot of the intervention programs haven't acknowledged that. I was doing some work with the government in the Yukon, and their strategy was to do more on the land gatherings with families and cultural, you know, activities together. And this was, the idea was if we rebuild families where they've been broken, a lot of the violence would stop. And I kept saying, but what about like the truckers? Look at the highway of tears. Those young women are, or mothers going into town to get services because there's no bus. Those aren't men from their community that are hurting them. These are other men. And because we don't deal with it properly, we have a state of what I call impunity. The systems don't work. The police don't have appropriate analysis some of the time, and it's really hard. They're interested in getting evidence to press charges, but lots of Indigenous women don't want to press charges against their own men. They don't believe that, they've seen their men get killed in jail. They don't want to go that route. So the system isn't very helpful. So I think it would be at least important to have this analysis that it's not only Indigenous men hurting Indigenous women. This is a problem. And if you know that you could hurt somebody and get away with it, like, the title of your book, How to Get Away with Murder, that's what's happening. And if you don't, if you're inclined to want to hurt and abuse and exploit other people, you're going to see a green light in Canada to be able to do that. Not so much if you're racialized or Indigenous, but if you're a white guy, and in these small communities, you might even be friends with the judge and the lawyers, that, like, who can afford a lawyer to defend them is also the question of who's getting actual access to justice services. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for your work. And I really appreciated how you were talking about trauma and how it's used so easily when it shouldn't. And that made me think a lot about Deanne Million's work, Therapeutic Nations, and the Know Me kind of, stigma of saying, yeah, this is a community that is pathologically not okay. And so let's take away their lands, let's justify that. And so I'm wondering when it might be appropriate, though, to use collective historical trauma, as we were hearing about a little bit with Dr. Riley, who is discussing about the cumulative effect, it being really structural, historical. And if you find that term to be, useful in certain cases. And I also appreciated how you also were kind of insinuating that trauma could be a euphemism for violence. And I also appreciate how in like this conference, we've been talking about euphemisms, right? Saying like, and the trickiness of it, like we're using one word to actually hide another one. So yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. Like just the idea of trauma is an individualizing kind of construct that hides the violence in society and places the problem in the mind of the victim. My colleague Alan Wade says, we've been tampering with the minds of women for decades to try to stop men's violence, and it hasn't worked. Although, like you say, I think there's a colloquial use. And if I go to a class or a lecture and I hear like racism coming from the presenter, I'll go out and say that was really traumatizing. I'll use it in a fun way, but it coming from the Greek, it means wound. And obviously our families were targeted and hurt and, destroyed in many, many ways. And so if I'm going to talk about that, I'm going to talk about the violence of the perpetrator. And if I'm going to talk about my people, I might talk about the grief and the loss, but I'll talk about like what they did. So what did they try to do? Like my Swedish grandpa, for example, he married my grandma who was from Fort Chipewyan, and the Indian agent used to come and try to take the children away. And he set up a little school for trappers. And there was probably like 4 children. And there was one, like 40-year-old Cree woman who would come because she wanted to learn, to speak languages. And the Indian agent would come and he would say, piss off, we have our own school, and the Indian agent would leave. So you could see, like in that case, obviously he had some white power, but it was like a community solution. And families always did things. They hid children, they put them with different relatives. they did everything they could to, like, there was a guy on Vancouver Island. I met him. He was like 60 years old. They hid him in the bush and he came out like 40 years later and he didn't know what a bank machine was or whatever, but he literally lived in the woods for decades because his parents put him there and he was so far away that he was able to live there untouched, and then came out and like different world. So that's what I look at these. I know not everybody here for some reason likes to talk about stories of resistance, but it's just anything that we did to try to protect ourselves, to uphold our dignity, and to show that we don't, we don't align with this violence. We don't approve of it morally, ethically, spiritually, and we just would never behave like that ourselves, So those are the stories that I'm interested in. Enough for me. Should I go sit down now?
Yeah,
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.